So if I asked you to point to the site of humanity's greatest space race, you'd probably point your finger right at Cape Canaveral in Florida.
Right, or maybe Baikonur in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, exactly. But, you'd actually be off by about 3,000 years. And, well, you'd be looking at the completely wrong side of the globe.
You really would.
I want you to picture Southeast Asia and Oceania. Usually, when we think of this massive part of the planet, our brains just immediately default to a very specific kind of packaged aesthetic.
Oh, absolutely. The vacation brochure image.
Exactly. We picture pristine tropical beaches, overwater bungalows, maybe, a surfer catching a wave.
Right, or scenes straight out of a tiki bar or a movie like Moana.
Yes. We have this deeply ingrained cultural habit of viewing this vast region as a sort of, well, primitive paradise.
Hmm.
A beautiful, relaxing, but ultimately, simple place.
And it's an incredibly pervasive image,
Mm.
but it actively hides the true scale of what happened there.
It really does.
If you actually look at the historical, archaeological, and sociological reality of this region, stretching from the rugged mountains of mainland Southeast Asia all the way across the Pacific Islands to Easter Island.
That is a massive area.
It's staggering. And you aren't looking at a simple paradise. You are looking at the site of humanity's most staggering, highly technical experiment in mobility.
Wow.
Yeah, mobility, cultural fusion, and survival.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to completely reframe how you view this entire half of the globe.
We really are.
We're throwing out the vacation brochures, and we're diving into the actual mechanics of how this region functioned. We've got a massive stack of historical and sociological notes to get through today.
We do, and to do that, we need a completely new framework. We need to look at this through the lens of the Austronesian maritime world.
Okay, so the Austronesian maritime world.
Right, and this requires you to do something a bit difficult, actually. You have to completely throw away your land-based, Eurocentric brain for the next hour.
That's harder than it sounds.
It is. Because when we are taught history in the West, we are taught to look at maps and see land as the center of the story.
Right. Land is where the empires sit.
Exactly. Land is where the borders are drawn, and the oceans are just the empty, dangerous gaps in between.
Like, oceans are barriers.
Yes. But in this region, that logic is entirely inverted.
The ocean isn't a barrier. The ocean is the highway.
Precisely. The water is the connective tissue.
That's such a cool way to think about it.
If you approach this region looking for land-based empires with, hard, static borders, you will entirely miss the brilliant, fluid systems of power and connection that actually existed.
It completely flips your perspective.
Yeah.
Suddenly, a map of the Pacific isn't an empty blue expanse with the tiny dots of isolated land.
No, it's a massive, bustling network of intersections.
Yeah. So let's pull you back in time all the way to the very beginning to understand how this profound relationship with the environment actually started.
Let's do it.
Because long before anyone was navigating by the stars across the open Pacific, there were the first footprints. We are going way back into deep prehistory, like roughly 65,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE.
The time frame alone demands a pause. We're talking about the arrival of humans in a landmass known as Sahul.
Sahu, right.
During the last ice age, global sea levels were drastically lower because, so much water was locked up in glaciers.
Right.
So Sahul was the massive, continuous continent that connected modern-day Australia, New Guinea, and the Aru Islands.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I need to clarify the geography here for everyone.
Sure.
Even with sea levels being hundreds of feet lower during the Ice Age, Sahul wasn't actually connected to the Asian mainland.
Correct. It was not.
There is a region between Asia and Sahul known as Wallachia. And Wallachia isn't just a shallow puddle, it's a series of islands separated by incredibly deep ocean trenches.
Yes, incredibly deep.
Trenches so deep they never froze over, and they never became land bridges, right?
Precisely. The Wallace Line represents a massive biogeographical divide. It's why you have, tigers and rhinos in Asia, but marsupials like kangaroos in Australia.
Oh, that makes sense. The animals couldn't cross those deep water straits.
They couldn't.
So if the animals couldn't walk across and the deep water trenches never disappeared, that means early humans crossing Wallachia tens of thousands of years ago.
They couldn't just wander over on foot.
Exactly. They had to cross open ocean.
You did.
That completely upends the timeline of human cognitive development. We're usually taught that early humans from this era were simple foragers, just reacting to their environment.
It utterly dismantles the simple early human myth. To get from the sun to shelf, which is the Asian landmass, across Wallacea and into Sahul, these populations had to make deliberate, multi-stage sea crossings.
Which means boats or rafts.
Right, they had to construct watercraft, likely advanced bamboo rafts, capable of surviving strong ocean currents.
So it wasn't just an accident.
Not at all. This wasn't an accident where a couple of people fell asleep on a log and drifted across.
Right, that's what people always assume.
But the sheer genetic diversity found in early Sahul indicates that there were multiple intentional migrations involving significant numbers of people.
And think about the mechanics of that. You are standing on a shore, and you can't even see the landmass you're trying to reach.
You can't see it at all.
How do you know it's there? How do you organize a group to build a craft and paddle into the unknown?
You do it through intense empirical observation of the environment.
Like what?
Well, they would have tracked the flight paths of migratory birds heading out over the horizon.
Oh, wow.
They would have noticed the smoke plumes from natural bushfires on distant, unseen islands.
That is so smart.
And they would have felt the changes in the water temperature and the currents. It required a level of cooperative organization, language, and ecological knowledge that proves these societies were incredibly sophisticated.
And we see that deep ecological knowledge continue to evolve once they actually settle in Sahul. Let's look at Australia.
A perfect example.
The indigenous populations there didn't just passively exist in the landscape, they engineered it.
They really did.
They developed a highly technical system of Aboriginal fire management, often called fire stick farming.
Yes. This is a perfect example of the distinction between living on the land versus living with the land.
Exactly.
They understood the complex chemistry and biology of the Australian bush. They used low-intensity fires to systematically clear underbrush.
So it wasn't chaotic burning?
No, it was precision agriculture.
I want to dig into how this actually worked because the mechanics are brilliant. By doing these controlled, cool burns during specific seasons, they prevented the massive, catastrophic wildfires that we see devastating Australia today.
Right, which happened because fuel is allowed to build up unchecked.
Exactly. But beyond just safety, the smoke and the ash actually acted as a catalyst, right?
They did. Many native Australian plant species have evolved to be highly dependent on fire.
Really?
Yeah, their seed pods are sealed with hard resins that only crack open and germinate when exposed to the specific heat and chemical compounds in smoke.
That is fascinating.
So, by managing the fire, indigenous Australians were actively dictating the germination of native flora.
Which in turn controlled the grazing patterns of animals.
Yes, like kangaroos. They were cultivating a massive, continent-wide garden without ever building a single fence or plowing a single field.
Meanwhile, if you look slightly to the north, in the highlands of New Guinea, you see another massive technological leap happening entirely independently.
You do.
We are talking about the Cook Swamp Archaeological Site.
In the New Guinea highlands, agriculture emerges completely on its own. Incredibly early in human history.
How early?
Around 7,000 to 10,000 years ago.
Wow. Because when we think of the birth of farming, we usually think of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East.
Right, or the Yangtze River Valley in China.
Exactly.
But the highland Papuan populations didn't wait for agriculture to be imported. They figured it out themselves, adapting perfectly to their specific, challenging equatorial highland ecology.
What were they growing?
They began independently domesticating and cultivating crops like taro, bananas, and yams.
Okay.
And they used complex mounding and drainage systems to manage the intense rainfall.
So looking at this deep prehistory, from the sea crossings of Wallacea to fire management to independent agriculture, it establishes a very specific sociological baseline for the entire region.
It does.
The people here are living deeply interconnected with nature. They are living with the volcanoes, the shifting monsoons, the complex reef systems.
They aren't fighting it.
Right. They aren't trying to build a stone box to hide from the environment. They are reading it, adapting to it, and integrating themselves into its rhythms.
That is the crucial baseline. Nature is an active, respected participant in their survival.
Okay.
But as the ice ages eventually ended, sea levels rose rapidly, flooding the sun to shelf and isolating these islands.
Right. The geography completely changed.
It did. The climate stabilized, and that profound relationship with the environment was about to be weaponized for the greatest expansion in human history.
Which brings us to the Neolithic era, roughly 3000 BCE to 500 BCE. This introduces a new technology, a new linguistic group of people, and an absolute explosion of movement.
A massive explosion.
We're talking about the Austronesian expansion.
The linguistic and archaeological records trace the roots of this massive movement to the area around modern-day Taiwan.
Okay, starting in Taiwan.
Right. From there, populations speaking Austronesian languages began moving south through the Philippines.
Spreading out rapidly through the thousands of islands of Southeast Asia.
Yes. And then they pushed eastward into the vast open expanse of the Pacific Ocean.
And remarkably, another branch sailed west, straight across the Indian Ocean, all the way to Madagascar.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of it.
Just to physically map that out for a second for everyone, from Madagascar, which is sitting right off the coast of Africa,
Right.
all the way to Easter Island, which is floating off the coast of South America.
It's immense.
That is practically half the circumference of the Earth.
It is arguably the greatest maritime dispersal in human history.
And what is most astounding is the technological context, right?
Exactly. They achieved this without magnetic compasses, without sextants, without chronometers, and obviously without GPS.
It's just wild to think about.
Their wayfinding systems were entirely organic, and they were, in this context, far superior to anything happening in Mediterranean or European navigation at the time.
I really want to spend some time on this because it's easy to just say, oh, they navigated by the stars and then move on.
It's a common oversimplification.
Right. But the actual mechanics of Polynesian wayfinding are so complex, it almost borders on superhuman.
It really does.
You are out in the open ocean in a double-hulled wooden outrigger canoe. There is no land in sight for weeks.
Just blue everywhere.
How do you actually know where you are? And how do you find an island that is essentially a speck of dust in an endless blue room?
It requires a mental map of the ocean that is perfectly integrated with the natural world.
Okay, so they did use stars, right?
Yes, they used a star compass. They memorized the exact rising and setting points of hundreds of stars across the horizon throughout the year.
Which is impressive enough on its own.
But what happens when it's cloudy? You can't just stop.
Right. The stars aren't always there, so what do?
That is where reading the ocean itself comes into play. Wayfinders were trained to read the swells.
Read the swells, like the waves.
Exactly. Out in the deep ocean, there are primary swells driven by the dominant trade winds.
Okay.
These swells move in constant, predictable directions. When one of these massive swells hits an island, well, something interesting happens.
Even an island that is hundreds of miles away and completely invisible over the horizon?
Yes. The energy of that wave reflects and refracts. It wraps around the landmass and bounces back out into the ocean, creating a secondary, much smaller wave pattern that intersects the primary swell.
Like dropping two pebbles in a pond and watching the ripples cross over each other?
That's a great analogy, yes. And a master navigator could literally feel that cross-hatching interference pattern in the hull of the canoe.
Wait, really? Feel it?
Yes. They would sometimes lie down in the bottom of the boat to physically feel the pitch, the roll, and the subtle yaw of the timber.
That is unbelievable.
It allowed them to identify the direction of an unseen island based on how the waves were bouncing off of it.
They are using the canoe as a massive sensory organ.
Exactly.
And they were also reading the sky. Right. But not just for stars.
They read the clouds. Certain low-hanging clouds only gather over land masses because of the heat radiating from the Earth.
Oh, that makes sense.
And if you're approaching a coral atoll with a shallow, bright blue or green lagoon in the middle of it,
Yeah.
the sunlight hits that bright water and reflects upward, painting a faint green underbelly on the clouds above it.
No way.
Yes. A navigator could spot that green reflection in the sky long before the island itself breached the horizon.
That is so incredibly observant.
They also track the flight paths of specific seabirds that fly out to fish in the morning and must return to land to roost at night.
They observed the bioluminescence in the water, too.
They did. Every single element of the environment was a data point.
It is the ultimate manifestation of living with nature. The ocean wasn't a void. It was a topography filled with highly detailed signposts.
If you only had the generational knowledge to read them.
Right. But getting to a remote volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific is only half the battle. Surviving there is the other half.
A much harder half sometimes.
Because you can't just step onto a barren volcanic rock and expect to find a grocery store waiting for you.
This is where their ecological mastery comes into play again. They didn't just sail. They brought their ecosystems with them.
The canoe plants. This is one of my absolute favorite details from the entire history.
It's a vital concept.
They brought portable food systems. We are talking about breadfruit, taro, yam, banana, sugarcane, coconut. To me, this is essentially a terraforming kit. like the ultimate ancient meals ready to eat.
It is a profound concept. The archaeobotanical evidence shows that they didn't just passively adapt to the islands they found.
They actively reshaped them.
They actively reshaped the ecology of those islands to make them habitable. Let's look at breadfruit, for example.
Okay, breadfruit.
Breadfruit is a high-yield, incredibly calorie-dense food. But most varieties of breadfruit are seedless.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can't just put a seed in your pocket. To transport it, you have to take a living root cutting from an existing tree.
So it's alive the whole time.
Yes, you carefully wrap it in damp moss or coconut husks and keep it alive and protect it from salt spray on a wooden canoe for thousands of miles across the open ocean.
Just to plant it in the soil of a new island.
Exactly.
You are literally transporting a living, breathing ecosystem. It's like going to Mars and bringing a biodome with you, but you're doing it in an outrigger canoe.
It's a great comparison.
And they brought animals too, right? Pigs, dogs, and chickens.
They did.
But what happens when these incoming Austronesian groups, armed with this incredible maritime and agricultural technology, encounter the people who are already living in some of these areas?
That's a crucial point.
Like the established Papuan populations in Oceania, around New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands.
Right.
Because usually, when a new technologically distinct group expands rapidly, world history tells us it's going to be a brutal story of eradication.
That is a critical point of departure for the history of this region. When we look at ancient DNA and linguistics, we see that this was not a simple hostile replacement story. It wasn't one group violently wiping out another and taking their land. Instead, it was a complex process of layering and mixing.
Interesting.
The Austronesian arrivals traded with the Papuan populations, they intermarried, they exchanged agricultural techniques.
It's the concept of identity as stacking. It doesn't overwrite, it layers. It's not either, it's and.
Exactly. You see a genetic and cultural blending. And that relentless process of migration, of moving people, terraforming plants, and sharing ideas eventually saturated the region.
The ocean highways became incredibly busy.
Very busy.
And that density brings us to the next major phase of our timeline. The rise of early maritime civilizations, roughly from 500 BCE to 1400 CE.
Right.
When we think of the word civilization in the ancient world, we have a very specific architectural bias.
We absolutely do.
We expect to see massive stone walls, standing armies, grid-like streets, and huge inland capital cities.
Like Rome or Babylon.
Exactly. And to be fair, you do see some of that traditional state building on the mainland of Southeast Asia. You have the rise of major agricultural states, places like Funan, Pagan, and Myanmar, and the absolute monumental architectural marvel of Angkor in Cambodia.
Those mainland states functioned much more like the empires we recognize in the West. They were built around fertile river plains. They relied heavily on wet rice agriculture, which requires intense irrigation. And their power was based on controlling immense amounts of agricultural labor.
And building massive temples.
They built monumental stone temples to project power. But when you look away from the mainland and focus on island Southeast Asia, you see a completely different, highly innovative model of civilization.
What do you see?
You see the rise of what political scientists call thalassocracies.
Thalassocracy. Let's break that down because it's a vital concept.
It translates literally to a maritime empire.
A maritime empire.
We're talking about massive polities like Srivijaya, based in Sumatra, and later the Majapahit Empire based in Java.
Okay.
For these empires, civilization and power were not defined by inland territorial rule. Their capitals weren't massive walled cities.
What were they?
Their capitals were often floating networks of ships and river-mouth settlements. Their power was built entirely around shipping lanes, secure ports, tributary networks, and controlling strategic choke points.
Like the Strait of Malacca.
Exactly. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow stretch of water between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra.
It's on all the maps.
It is the fastest, most direct route connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Srivijaya understood that if you control the flow of ships through that strait, you don't need to conquer the inland jungles.
You simply tax the trade.
Yes. To really understand how this worked, we have to look at the mandala style of governance.
This concept completely broke my brain in the best way possible.
It's very different from what we're used to.
Because we are so used to the Westphalian model of states, the idea that a country has a hard, fixed border.
In a mandala system, borders are incredibly fuzzy, almost non-existent in a territorial sense.
Right.
The best way to visualize it is like a solar system. The ruler, or the main port, is the sun.
Okay.
Power radiates outward from that center like a gravitational pull. The closer you are to the center, the stronger the influence and control.
Makes sense.
But as you move further out into the periphery, that influence naturally fades.
So what does this all mean for a regular person? Like, it's based on negotiated loyalty and tribute rather than a sharp territorial boundary defended by an army.
Exactly.
If I'm a local chieftain on a smaller island out in the periphery, how does my life actually function under a mandala system?
Well, it's fluid.
Because if I lived on the edge of the Roman Empire, I knew exactly where the empire ended. There was a literal wall, Hadrian's Wall. You were either inside Roman law or you were outside of it. It was binary.
If you lived in the outer ripples of a mandala system, your relationship with the central power was highly fluid and situational.
Okay.
As a local chief, you might recognize the supreme authority of the Srivijayan Maharaja. You might send annual tribute, perhaps forest products, gold, or spices, to the center.
And what will I get in return?
In exchange, you received prestige items, titles, and military protection, and you got the right to trade safely within their massive network.
But what about locally?
Locally, in your own village, you still completely manage your own affairs. The Central Empire didn't send a governor to dictate your daily laws or enforce a uniform language.
Power was relational. It was about who you knew, who you traded with, and your kinship ties.
Yes.
It was power through connection and mutual benefit rather than power through strict boots-on-the-ground control.
Precisely. It was a brilliant adaptation to an archipelago environment where attempting to militarily control thousands of heavily forested islands would be an impossible drain on resources.
It just wouldn't work.
And we see similar, highly complex non-territorial adaptations out in the Pacific Oceania region as well. Let's look at the Lapita cultural complex.
Yes, the Lapita. Whenever archaeologists talk about the spread of people through the Pacific, Lapita pottery is the smoking gun.
The Lapita people are the ancestors of historic Polynesian cultures, and we track their movement primarily through their incredibly distinctive pottery.
What's it called again?
It's called dentate-stamped pottery. They would take a small comb-like tool, possibly made from turtle, shell, or bone, and stamp intricate, repeating geometric patterns into the wet clay before firing it.
Very recognizable.
Very. By tracing where these specific, highly decorated potsherds are buried, archaeologists can map a vast, interconnected trade network that spanned thousands of miles across the Pacific.
It proves they weren't just landing on islands and isolating themselves.
Not at all.
They were sailing back and forth, trading obsidian, shells, and pottery across immense distances.
So constantly moving.
And this interconnectedness laid the groundwork for the massive Polynesian chiefdoms that emerged later in places like Tonga, Hawaii, and Aotearoa, New Zealand.
It's vital to stress that these Polynesian chiefdoms were highly organized, deeply sophisticated political solutions.
Right.
We shouldn't look at them as less developed versions of Eurasian states just because they didn't forge iron weapons or build massive inland cities.
It's a different context entirely.
In an island environment, your constraints are entirely different. Land is fiercely limited. Freshwater is limited.
So how did they manage that without a massive central bureaucracy?
They developed intricate systems of social rank, deeply codified land tenure, and ritual authority.
Like what?
In Hawaii, for example, the Ahupuo system was a brilliant ecological management tool.
Yeah, Ahupuo.
They divided the land into wedge-shaped sections that ran from the top of the volcanic mountain all the way down into the ocean.
So everyone gets a slice of everything.
Exactly. This meant that every community within that wedge had access to forest resources for building canoes, agricultural land for taro, and coastal access for fishing.
That's incredibly efficient.
The political structure was designed to manage resources and mitigate conflict in an ecologically fragile environment.
Which again dispels that simple, primitive paradise myth. These were rigorous, socially complex, and highly disciplined societies.
They had to be.
And as these maritime hubs and island networks across the whole Austronesian world grew in power and sophisticated organization, they naturally became massive magnets for global commerce.
The world wanted what they had.
Which transitions us perfectly into the era of the cosmopolitan coastlines and the spice engine, roughly 1400 to 1800.
This is the era when the region truly becomes the crossroads for the entire globe. The maritime trade networks explode in volume.
That's a huge boom.
We see a massive, sustained influx of Chinese merchants, Indian traders, and Arab seafarers flowing into the port cities of Southeast Asia.
Think of these port cities not just as docks, but as like 19th century stock exchange floors mixed with massive international transit terminals.
Exactly like ancient Silicon Valleys.
Yeah, they were the absolute epicenters of global innovation, staggering wealth, and intense cultural cross-pollination.
And the physical reality of maritime travel at the time forced this cosmopolitanism.
Because of the winds, right?
Right. During the age of sail, trade was entirely dictated by the monsoon winds. The winds blow in one direction for half the year and then reverse.
So you can't just leave whenever you want.
No. This meant that a merchant ship arriving from the Middle East or India couldn't just drop off its cargo and immediately sail home. They had to stay in the Southeast Asian port for months, waiting for the winds to change.
So you had thousands of foreign merchants literally setting up shop living in these cities for half the year.
It was a massive melting pot.
Being multilingual in a place like Malacca or Banten wasn't an impressive resume builder. It was the bare minimum for survival.
You had to speak everything.
You had to know how to negotiate with the Arab spice trader in the morning, the Chinese silk merchant at noon, and the local Javanese harbor master in the afternoon.
And with the intense movement of people and goods, naturally comes the movement of ideas, specifically religion.
Right, religion travels with trade.
We see the rapid spread of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and later Christianity through these maritime networks. But what is truly remarkable is how these religions were adopted by the local populations.
Because they weren't adopted pure.
Right, exactly. They were rarely adopted in their strict, orthodox, imported forms.
Because of that layering concept we talked about earlier, they didn't view a new religion as a requirement to erase their old beliefs.
It was profound syncretism. A local ruler might adopt Islam because it aligned him with the incredibly wealthy Arab and Indian trade networks.
Giving him a new vocabulary of power and access to global credit.
Yes. But that didn't mean he stopped honoring the spirits of the land or his ancestors.
So you see architectural blends, too.
You see mosques built not with Middle Eastern domes, but with multi-tiered pagoda-like roofs that reflect local architectural and spiritual tradition.
That is so cool.
You see Hindu epics like the Ramayana being performed using traditional Javanese shadow puppetry, subtly blending imported theology with deeply local philosophy.
Religion here was pragmatic, adaptable, and deeply layered.
And we absolutely cannot talk about this era without addressing the massive economic catalyst that was driving so much of this intense global traffic.
The spice engine.
The spice engine. We were talking about nutmeg, cloves, mace, cinnamon pepper.
It is difficult for a modern person who can buy a jar of nutmeg at the grocery store for $3 to comprehend the historical weight of these specific agricultural products.
It's hard to grasp.
Southeast Asian spices were world historical commodities. I really want to emphasize the scale of this for you all listening.
It reshaped the world.
The entire global economy was literally reorganized because people in Europe, the Middle East, and China fundamentally desired the tastes, the scents, and the perceived medicinal properties of plants that only grew on a few tiny specific islands in this region.
Take nutmeg and cloves, for example. For centuries, nutmeg only grew in one place on Earth.
Only one place.
The tiny Banda Islands in the Maluku archipelago, often called the Spice Islands. Cloves were similarly restricted to a few small volcanic islands nearby. The specific combination of equatorial sunlight, volcanic soil, and island microclimates created a monopoly by nature.
And by the time a sack of nutmeg made its way from the Banda Islands through the Mandala trading networks onto an Arab dhow, across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, overland to Alexandria, and onto a Venetian galley to be sold in Europe.
The markup was absolutely astronomical.
It was worth its weight in gold.
It really was. The desire to bypass the middlemen and control the source of these aromatics directly drove the advancement of global maritime technology, funded the expansion of massive empires, and literally redrew the maps of global trade routes.
It was the engine of early globalization.
But, as history shows us repeatedly, generating that kind of immense wealth and holding that much strategic geographic importance inevitably draws a very specific kind of gaze.
The gaze of outsiders.
Yes, outsiders who do not understand the nuanced relational mandala system. Outsiders who do not care about fluid boundaries or negotiated tribute, and who want to lock this entirely dynamic world into hard, fixed lines.
Which brings us to the colonial era, stretching roughly from the 1500s up through 1945.
Now, this is a difficult but necessary history.
And as we move into this next era, I want to be really clear with you, the listener. We are looking at a stack of historical sources here regarding the colonial era.
Yes, and it's important to state, we are just reporting impartially, on the historical record detailed in these texts. We aren't taking any ideological sides here.
Right, exactly. We are simply conveying the historical facts regarding dispossession and economic shifts as they are presented in the source material without endorsing any specific political viewpoints.
Precisely. So looking objectively at the arrival of European powers, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the French, along with the United States and later Imperial Japan.
We see profound alterations.
We absolutely do.
Looking at the historical texts, the arrival of these outside powers initiated a massive structural rewiring of everyday life. The economic focus shifted entirely from complex, multi-layered regional trade to pure extraction.
Right. We see the imposition of massive plantation economies.
How is that different from before?
Prior to this, agricultural systems in the region were highly diverse and polycultural, meaning they grew many different things together to ensure food security and ecological balance.
And the colonizers changed that.
Colonial powers converted vast tracts of land into massive monocrops for pure export. Rubber, sugar, coffee, tobacco. They instituted massive, ecologically destructive mining operations for tin and gold.
We also see the introduction of rigid, institutionalized racial hierarchies, right? The colonial powers introduced modern censuses.
Yes. And a census isn't just counting people. It's a tool of categorization.
It forced deeply fluid, multi-layered identities into strict, rigid boxes. You were suddenly legally defined as native or foreign oriental or European.
And those categories strictly dictated where you could live, what jobs you could hold, and your legal rights.
And in Oceania, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, we see the aggressive implementation of settler colonialism.
We do. This wasn't just about extracting resources, it was about replacing the population.
The sources outline a mass dispossession of territory.
Yes. It involved the profound demographic alteration of the land, mass dispossession, and the systematic marginalization of the indigenous populations who had been managing those ecologies for tens of thousands of years.
And if we connect this deeply to the sociological shift we've been tracking, the shift from fluidity to rigidity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most devastating conceptual impact across the entire region was the mapping.
The mapping. Explain the physical impact of a map, because a map seems harmless.
Right, but remember the mandala system. Power was relational, borders were porous, and allegiances shifted based on the gravitational pull of trade and charisma.
Right.
Colonialism took that fluid, negotiated sphere and forced it into the rigid Westphalian territorial units of Europe. They took a world defined by movement and connection, and they drew hard lines on the water.
They literally sat in drawing rooms in London and Amsterdam and carved up islands.
They did.
Take the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824. The British and the Dutch literally drew a line right down the middle of the Strait of Malacca.
Yes.
They took the ancient, deeply connected Johor Sultanate, which spanned both sides of the strait, and split it in half.
A completely arbitrary division.
The British got the peninsula side, which eventually became Malaysia, and the Dutch got the island side, which eventually became Indonesia. They permanently separated kin groups and severed ancient trade routes just to satisfy European territorial claims.
It was an attempt to build Hadrian's Wall on top of the ocean. They assigned distinct, permanent territorial ownership to European capitals thousands of miles away.
So my immediate question is, how did the local populations actually survive this?
It's a great question.
If your entire sociological foundation, your way of viewing the world for thousands of years, is based on fluidity, mobility, and situational identity, and suddenly a heavily armed empire drops a rigid bureaucratic grid on top of you, how do you endure that intense restructuring without your culture entirely shattering?
They survived through the region's most ancient, defining trait: adaptability.
Adaptability.
The historical record shows an incredibly sophisticated strategy of resilience. Outwardly, the local populations often absorbed the new colonial structures.
They complied.
They worked on the plantations, they navigated the new bureaucratic laws, they lived within the freshly drawn borders. But inwardly, beneath the surface of colonial compliance, they fiercely preserved their deeper layers of identity.
They protected the core.
Exactly. They maintained their complex kinship networks. They continued their local rituals honoring the ancestors. They preserved their customary laws regarding community dispute resolution.
So it was like a dual existence.
Resilience, in this context, became a recurring, multi-generational social habit. They learned to operate within the rigid colonial framework during the day, while keeping their fluid, deeply connected cultural core alive underneath it all.
Which is an incredible testament to human endurance. But geopolitically, it sets up an absolute powder keg for the future.
Oh, absolutely.
Because eventually, after the devastation of World War II, those colonial empires were bankrupted, exhausted, and either retreated or were violently pushed out by local independence movements.
And that leads us to the massive narrative transition of the 20th century.
The newly independent nations were left holding maps they didn't draw.
That is the central defining dilemma of the modern era, stretching from 1945 to the present. We are moving into the post-colonial era and the rapid shift into intense globalization.
Right.
When these sweeping independence movements successfully threw off colonial rule, the new sovereign states largely inherited the exact borders the colonial powers had drawn.
And those borders, as we just established, were totally arbitrary.
They were.
They cut right through ancient cultural worlds and simultaneously smashed together groups that had entirely different histories.
Which means modern nations in this region are essentially tasked with an almost impossible sociological project: building a cohesive, unified country out of wildly diverse, densely packed, and geographically fragmented groups.
Just look at the demographic mosaic today. It is dizzying.
It really is.
Within a single national border, you might have Javanese, Tagalog, Kin, Papuan, Maori, massive, generations-old Chinese diaspora communities, Indian communities, and hundreds of deeply distinct indigenous groups, all speaking different languages and practicing different religions.
It is arguably the most densely diverse region on the planet.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Yes.
This is where the historical concept of layering that we've been discussing becomes intensely practically relevant today.
This concept of layered identity is so fascinating. The text refers to it as identity functioning like sediment.
Sediment, like layers of rock.
Right. In the West, we often have this expectation that identity should be singular and clean. You are one thing. But here, because of this deep, layered history, identity is highly situational.
Exactly. A person living in Indonesia today, for example, can be deeply indigenous to their specific village, honoring local land spirits, and they can hold a broader regional identity as a Minangkabau. And they can be a devout practitioner of a major global religion like Islam.
Yes.
And they can be a fiercely proud, patriotic citizen of the modern Indonesian nation-state. And they can be a fully plugged-in participant in globalized digital culture.
It's not a contradiction. Identity shifts depending on who you're speaking with and what the situation requires. It is a survival mechanism honed over thousands of years of trade and movement.
But managing a state full of layered identities creates profound, ongoing, modern tensions. Let's walk through the key tensions the text identifies.
First, you have the tension of tradition versus progress. The region is experiencing massive, rapid economic growth.
Huge growth.
Modern economic forces like hyper-connected digital infrastructure, mass international tourism, and massive resource extraction like nickel mining for electric vehicle batteries bring undeniable, life-changing economic opportunity.
But at a cost.
Exactly. These forces often directly threaten sacred ancestral lands, linguistic continuity, and customary authority.
It's the friction between building a new semiconductor plant and protecting a 1,000-year-old rice terrace.
That's exactly it.
Second, you have the tension of unity versus fragmentation. This is the struggle of archipelagic states. How do you build a single, cohesive national identity, say in the Philippines or Indonesia, which is made up of over 17,000 islands, when the physical geography itself resists centralization?
It requires immense political effort to ensure that the outer islands don't feel entirely marginalized and extracted by the central capital.
And a third, deeply profound tension exists heavily in Oceania, the reality of incomplete decolonization.
Right, the concept of the Blue Pacific.
What does that mean geopolitically?
While many states in the Pacific achieved full independence, several territories remain under outside administration by powers like France or the United States. But more profoundly, the Blue Pacific is a diplomatic and cultural movement to reassert that original, deep prehistory Austronesian mindset.
Oh,
For decades, the West has referred to Pacific nations as small island developing states, framing them as tiny, isolated, vulnerable dots dependent on the charity of larger continents.
the Blue Pacific narrative rejects that.
It completely rejects that.
Yeah.
It frames the ocean not as an empty void that separates them, but as a massive, shared, deeply connected sovereign space. They aren't small island states. They are massive ocean states.
They are reclaiming the highway. They are looking at the map the way their ancestors did.
They are.
And when you look at the major geopolitical conflicts in the region today, they are rarely just about who owns a specific rock. They are about flow.
Yes, flow and choke points.
Look at the immense tension in the South China Sea. It's about who controls the choke points, the shipping lanes, the undersea internet cables, the fishing rights. It's the modern version of Srivijaya trying to control the Strait of Malacca. The historical echoes are incredibly loud.
The history is still actively dictating the present. Yet, despite this incredible, dense complexity, the genius of ancient wayfinding, the intricacies of mandala politics, the deep trauma and resilience of the colonial era, the intense modern geopolitical chess game, the rest of the world often stubbornly refuses to see it.
Which brings us full circle back to where we started. Section 7, dispelling the myth of tropical simplicity. We have to address the danger of pop culture stereotyping.
The region has absolutely saturated global pop culture. You have the pervasive surf imaginaries, the mid-century tiki bar aesthetics that blended entirely unrelated cultures into a cocktail theme, and massive global blockbusters like Moana, which, to its credit, introduced the brilliance of Polynesian voyaging to a massive global audience.
But this intense visibility is a double-edged sword.
This raises an important question. How does it actually damage the perception of the region?
It brings a certain level of cultural pride, sure, but it actively flattens the reality.
It does.
It takes societies that were deeply sophisticated, historically martial, intensely political, and strategically brilliant, and reduces them to generic, innocent island vibes.
It strips away the complex statecraft.
Yes, and the brutal colonial conflicts and the immense intellectual achievements of these cultures, leaving behind a sanitized caricature. It's exactly like reading only the 2-sentence summary on the back of a massive 1,000-page, incredibly dark and complex novel, and then confidently walking around assuming you deeply understand all the characters and their motivations.
It is a perfect analogy.
The primitive paradise image actively hurts these nations because it makes them seem passive. It makes them seem like background characters in global history when their entire story is actually about active, brilliant, often aggressive adaptation.
And that brings us to the true sociological core of the text we've been analyzing today. When you strip away the stereotypes, what is the deep, enduring human lesson to be extracted from the history of Southeast Asia and Oceania?
It is a profound lesson about the nature of survival. The lesson is that identity doesn't have to be static or pure or walled off to be deeply meaningful.
No, it doesn't.
The texts note that the people of this region possess an incredible capacity to hold immense grief. They carry the deep wounds of colonialism, of historical trauma, of profound ecological fragility, right alongside incredibly vibrant, undeniable joy.
The communal warmth, the massive festivals, the intense dedication to kinship.
The text beautifully describes their historical journey as a story of dancing through storms.
Dancing through storms is the perfect metaphor. It is the ultimate historical rejection of the Western idea that survival requires total, rigid control over your environment.
Right.
The people of this region survived by choosing connection over isolation. They chose courage and extreme adaptability over rigid domination. They learned over tens of thousands of years exactly what parts of their culture had to be fiercely protected at all costs and what parts could be fluidly remade to fit a rapidly changing world.
What an absolute marathon of a journey we've just been on.
It really was.
We started in deep prehistory with Aboriginal communities using controlled fire to expertly manage the ecology of an entire Ice Age continent.
We rode in the hulls of Austronesian outriggers with navigators who read the reflection of waves to cross half the globe.
Carrying living, breathing ecosystems in their canoes, we walked through cosmopolitan port cities that blended global religions and drove the entire world's economy through the spice engine.
And we looked at modern hybrid megacities navigating the incredibly messy, sedimented layers of colonial maps and digital progress.
And through all of those eras, the connective spine remains entirely intact.
The history of Southeast Asia and Oceania proves, unequivocally, that oceans are engines of civilization, not the empty, terrifying gaps between them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. As we look around our modern, highly globalized world today, we see a lot of land-based nations terrified of change.
We see a lot of fear, yeah.
We see countries frantically trying to build literal and metaphorical walls to stop the flow of people, to stop the chaos of the digital age, to hold back the rising tides and the realities of climate change. We are culturally obsessed with building stronger, thicker fortresses.
But maybe that's the wrong approach entirely.
Exactly. Maybe the ultimate key to humanity's future survival isn't building a thicker wall. Maybe the key is adopting the Austronesian mindset.
I love that thought.
Maybe our future depends on learning to navigate the turbulent tides, carrying our roots with us wherever we go, and realizing that our absolute greatest strength as a species is our ability to adapt, to mix, and to connect across the vast open waters of an uncertain future.
We have to learn to read the waves rather than perpetually trying to stop them from crashing.
Exactly. So the next time you picture a pristine beach, an overwater bungalow, or a stretch of blue Pacific water, remember, you aren't looking at a simple primitive paradise. You are looking at the greatest, most complex highway in human history.